The ruthless executive thought she could embarrass Big Shaq and keep him out of power. The boardroom elites smirked, thinking they had already won. But when the CEO announcement drops, the entire room is left in shock. Now, Shaq isn't just at the table. He owns it. And the game? It's about to change forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The glass doors of the conference room reflected the morning sun, casting sharp angles of light across the long mahogany table. A dozen executives, dressed in finely tailored suits, sat in their designated seats, murmuring among themselves. At the head of the table, Gerald Vaughn, the long-standing CEO of Vaughn Tech, an empire of innovation and commerce, adjusted his tie, his weathered face unreadable. Today was supposed to be an ordinary quarterly meeting. It was anything but. Shaquille O'Neal stepped inside with his usual effortless presence, his towering frame commanding attention. He wasn't a man who needed to assert dominance. It came naturally. Dressed in a navy blue custom suit, he moved with ease, his steps light for a man of his size. Some of the board members greeted him with respectful nods, while others, particularly those with vested interests, exchanged guarded glances. He had been invited months ago as an advisor, someone to bridge the company's future with strong leadership. But there was something in the air today, something calculated, something lurking beneath the surface. Across the table sat Meredith Lane, Vaughn Tech's senior vice president of corporate strategy. A woman in her mid-40s, her presence was as sharp as her words, well put together, well spoken, and undeniably ambitious. But there was something else about her, something cold. She was known for playing her cards ruthlessly, for ensuring that anyone who stood in her way either bent to her will or was swiftly eliminated. And today, her sights were set on Shaq. As he pulled out a chair and settled in, Gerald cleared his throat, signaling the meeting's official start. The lights dimmed slightly as a projector whirred to life, displaying the company's latest performance charts. Meredith took the floor, striding to the screen, her heels clicking against the marble. "Let's begin," she announced, her voice smooth yet laced with something close to condescension. "Now, before we discuss the upcoming restructuring plans, I think we should address an ongoing concern. A concern that, quite frankly, affects the integrity of this company's leadership." Shaq folded his hands on the table, watching her intently. The tension in the room shifted, subtle but noticeable. Some executives leaned forward, others exchanged glances, already sensing where this was going. Meredith turned slightly toward him, her lips curling into a rehearsed professional smile. "Shaquille, you've had quite the impressive career. A basketball legend, a media personality, an entrepreneur. Truly admirable. But let's be honest, Vaughn Tech is a different arena, wouldn't you say?" The room went quiet. A few executives turned their attention to Shaq, waiting to see how he'd react. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He had been in boardrooms like this before, had seen this kind of subtle power play, where words weren't spoken in anger but in veiled daggers. Meredith continued, feigning concern. "Now, I understand you've been advising on some of our strategic initiatives, but given the complexities of corporate governance, finance, and global expansion, don't you think it might be challenging for someone with your background to fully grasp the nuances of such a fast-paced industry?" A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Others remained silent, watching. Shaq let her words settle. The way she phrased it, she made it sound like she was merely asking a thoughtful question. But he knew better. The underlying message was clear: you don't belong here. He met her gaze, his expression calm but unwavering. "That's an interesting point, Meredith," he said, his voice deep and steady. "But let's talk about real challenges, the kind that define leadership. Leadership isn't just about knowing numbers. It's about understanding people, vision, and the ability to adapt. And if we're talking about fast-paced industries, I'd say spending 19 years in the NBA taught me a thing or two about strategy under pressure." A few executives smirked, appreciating the response. But Meredith wasn't one to back down. She clasped her hands together, tilting her head slightly. Of course. And no one is questioning your achievements. I mean, We all admire the work you've done outside of sports, your ventures, your endorsements. But VonTech isn't a franchise. We don't operate on entertainment value. We operate on results. Shaq exhaled silently, recognizing the game she was playing. She wanted him to react emotionally, to get defensive, to stumble over his words so she could prove her point. But he wasn't going to give her that. Before he could respond, Gerald interjected, his gravelly voice cutting through the room. Meredith, I believe Shaquille's contributions to this board have been nothing but valuable, and as far as results go, his insights into market expansion have already led to increased projections in Q3. So let's not undermine expertise just because it doesn't fit into traditional corporate molds. Meredith's jaw tightened ever so slightly. She hadn't expected Gerald to come to Shaq's defense so quickly. But she wasn't done yet. She turned to the screen and clicked to the next slide. Let's look at the numbers, shall we? Market analysts have projected that VonTech's expansion into newer demographics requires precise targeting. Now, while certain branding initiatives have worked in niche markets, there's concern that relying too much on celebrity influence could, how do I put this, dilute the company's core credibility. Shaq recognized the maneuver. She was implying that his presence, his brand, was a liability, that his association with VonTech made them look less corporate, less serious. He leaned forward, finally breaking his composed stance, just enough to make his presence more pronounced. Meredith, let me ask you something. VonTech's core customer base is shifting, correct? She hesitated, not liking where this was going. Yes, we're expanding into younger, more diverse demographics. Shaq nodded. And these demographics, do they respond better to cold corporate messaging? Or do they engage with brands that feel authentic, brands that understand them? Meredith's silence was enough of an answer. Shaq continued, his voice steady. You see, credibility isn't just about suits and titles. It's about trust. And trust doesn't come from boardroom politics. It comes from connection. If VonTech wants to grow, it needs to evolve. And evolving means understanding the people you serve, not just the numbers you report. The silence in the room was heavy. Some of the board members nodded subtly, seeing the logic in his words. Even Gerald seemed impressed. Meredith, however, wasn't about to concede. Not yet. She straightened, smoothing her blazer as she gave a practiced smile. Well, Shaquille, I suppose time will tell whether your vision aligns with VonTech's future. Shaq simply smiled. Time always tells. The meeting continued, moving on to other agenda points. But the tension never fully dissolved. Shaq could feel it. The undercurrents, the whispers, the unspoken resistance. Meredith wasn't finished with her game, but neither was he. As the meeting adjourned and executives began filtering out, Gerald placed a firm hand on Shaq's shoulder. Stay sharp, he murmured. She's playing a long game. Shaq gave a small nod. He already knew. What he didn't know yet was just how far she was willing to go. As he stepped out into the hallway, the weight of the moment settled in. This wasn't just about a meeting. This was a chessboard, and the pieces were already in motion. And Shaq? He wasn't just a player in this game. He was about to change it. The meeting room emptied in slow waves, leaving behind the faint hum of whispered conversations and the muted shuffle of designer shoes against polished floors. Executives exited in groups, some exchanging pleasantries, others throwing discreet glances in Shaquille O'Neal's direction. He caught them, every one of them. They weren't just looks of curiosity. They carried something deeper, something unspoken. A hesitation, a calculation. Shaq remained seated, his large hands clasped together on the table, eyes steady. He wasn't just thinking about what had happened. He was dissecting it, pulling it apart thread by thread. Meredith Lane had come prepared. That wasn't improvisation. That was precision. An attempt to chip away at him in front of the board, to plant doubt, to make him look like an outsider in a world where she believed he didn't belong. Gerald Vaughn lingered by the doorway, watching the last few board members disappear into the hallway before stepping back inside. He shut the door quietly, his expression unreadable as he moved toward Shaq. You handled that well, Gerald muttered, placing a firm hand on the back of a chair. Kept your composure, That's more than I can say for most people who've gone toe-to-toe with Meredith. Shaq exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly. That wasn't a debate. That was a setup. Gerald nodded, rubbing his fingers together absently. She's testing the waters, seeing who's on her side, who's on the fence. His voice dropped lower, carrying weight. And seeing how much pushback she'll get if she makes a move against you. Shaq already knew. He had played enough games, studied enough strategies, both on and off the court, to recognize when an opponent was running a play. And Meredith? She was laying the groundwork for something bigger. The problem wasn't just her, it was the silence. The unspoken alliances in the room. Not one board member had openly supported her, but no one had openly challenged her either. That was the real danger. Not the words spoken, but the ones left unsaid. Gerald let out a slow breath and straightened. You need to be careful, Shaq. Meredith isn't just playing politics. She's playing survival. She sees you as a threat. And when people like her feel threatened, they don't just fight back. They eliminate the problem. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but sharp. Then I guess I need to see exactly what she's planning. Shaq spent the next few days watching, listening. He made no sudden moves, no reactionary decisions. Instead, he studied the shifting tides inside Vontech. He saw how certain executives, ones who had once been neutral, now seemed hesitant to engage with him directly. How casual hallway conversations quieted when he approached. How his suggestions in follow-up meetings were met with polite nods but little enthusiasm. And then there were the ones who remained on the fence. The ones who kept their heads down, watching from the sidelines, waiting to see how things played out before choosing a side. Shaq understood them. He didn't like it, but he understood. Corporate survival wasn't that different from locker room politics. Some people stood on principle, others stood where it was safest. Meredith, on the other hand, had become more emboldened. Subtle, but emboldened. She no longer concealed her dismissiveness. In meetings, she was quick to challenge his perspectives, questioning his expertise with the same veiled condescension she had used before. She interrupted him, undermined him with carefully chosen words, never outright disrespectful, but always just enough to shift perception. Shaq let her talk, let her weave her narrative. Because the more she tried to paint him as unfit, the more obvious her own fear became. Then came the real play. It started as a whisper. A quiet, controlled narrative slipping through the cracks of Vontech's inner circle. Investors, it was said, were growing concerned about the company's leadership direction. There was talk of potential instability, of decisions being made by people who lacked corporate experience. Shaq wasn't surprised when the rumors found their way to him. If Meredith wanted to push him out, she had to start higher up, where real power resided. He received a call from one of the company's major stakeholders, a longtime investor named Charles Hennington. An old-money businessman who had been with Vontech since its inception. Charles wasn't the kind of man who liked uncertainty, and that's exactly what Meredith was feeding him. Shaq met him at a private club downtown, a place where billionaires and industry leaders went to have conversations that never made it to the press. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of aged whiskey and polished wood. Charles sat in a leather chair, fingers wrapped around a glass, his expression carefully neutral. "You've built quite the name for yourself, Shaquille," Charles said, swirling his drink. "An icon, a businessman, a philanthropist. But tell me something. What do you want with Vontech?" Shaq met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I want to see it grow, expand. Not just in revenue, but in reach. You don't build a lasting company by playing it safe. You build it by making sure it stays relevant." Charles exhaled, taking a slow sip. "And you think you're the right man for that?" Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "I know I am." Charles studied him for a long moment. Then he set his glass down. "There's talk going around. Concerns that leadership is shifting in a direction that might unsettle certain investors." Shaq nodded. "And let me guess, Meredith is leading that conversation." Charles didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. "Meredith is cautious. She believes stability is key." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Stability is an excuse for stagnation. Companies don't fail because they take risks. They fail because they refuse to evolve. Charles considered that, rubbing his chin. Perhaps. But tell me, why should I back you over someone like Meredith? Shaq didn't hesitate. Because Meredith plays for power. I play for legacy. And when you're investing in a future, you bet on the one who understands people, not just profits. Another long silence. Then, to Shaq's quiet satisfaction, Charles gave a small nod. I'll be watching, he said. But for now, I'm not making any moves. Shaq left that meeting knowing one thing for sure. Meredith wasn't just trying to push him out. She was trying to solidify herself as the next leader. Gerald Vaughn's seat wasn't going to be empty for long, and she wanted to make sure she was the only real option. She had allies, silent ones who weren't willing to take risks, but also wouldn't stop her if she made her move. Shaq wasn't going to sit back anymore. The next morning, he walked into Vaughn Tech's headquarters earlier than usual. He met with department heads, not in official meetings, but in casual conversations. He listened, asked questions, understood where the real pulse of the company was. And most importantly, he made sure that by the time Meredith made her next move, he'd already be 5 steps ahead. Because this wasn't just about corporate politics anymore. This was a game of control. And Shaq was about to change the rules. The Vaughn Tech boardroom was once again filled with its usual players. Something was different today. The tension was thicker, the anticipation heavier. Everyone could feel it, but no one was saying it out loud. Shaquille O'Neal entered the room, his presence as effortless as ever. He had seen these kinds of moments before. The build-up before a game-defining play, the silence before a buzzer beater. Today was no different. Meredith Lane was already seated, her expression neutral, but her posture rigid. She hadn't spoken to him directly in days, but she didn't need to. He knew what she had been doing behind the scenes, rallying her silent allies, spreading doubts, planting seeds of hesitation. At the head of the table, Gerald Vaughn sat with his fingers laced together, his face unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something settled, decided. Shaq noticed it immediately. This wasn't just another meeting. Something was about to shift. Gerald cleared his throat, silencing the low murmurs around the room. Before we begin with today's agenda, I have an important announcement. His voice, though steady, carried a weight that made the entire room still. Shaq didn't move. He simply listened. Gerald exhaled slowly, glancing around the table before continuing. After 35 years of leading this company, I have made a decision. A difficult one, but one that I know is right. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. Effective immediately, I will be stepping down as CEO of Vaughn Tech. A stunned silence filled the room. Some executives exchanged quick glances, while others sat frozen. Even Meredith's carefully controlled expression faltered for just a second. Shaq remained still. He had expected a change in leadership at some point, but today? This soon? Even he hadn't seen that coming. Gerald let the weight of his words settle before continuing. This company has meant everything to me. I've spent decades building it, growing it, making sure it stands for something beyond just profit margins. And I want that vision to continue. Which is why I have chosen someone I trust. Someone with the vision, the integrity, and the leadership to take Vaughn Tech into the future. A flicker of something, anticipation, calculation, crossed Meredith's face. She straightened slightly, already preparing her response, expecting her name to be spoken next. Gerald turned his gaze toward Shaq. My successor, he said, is Shaquille O'Neal. The room froze. The weight of the words crashed down like a tidal wave, and for a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Then all at once reactions flared. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the board. Some executives whispered to each other. Others sat wide-eyed, caught between shock and confusion. And then there was Meredith. Her carefully composed expression shattered, just for a second. Her lips parted slightly as if she had misheard. Her fingers curled against the table, grip tightening. She was already running through the calculations, trying to understand how this had happened, how she had miscalculated so badly. Shaq, meanwhile, remained calm. He didn't react, didn't gloat. He simply held Gerald's gaze, reading between the lines of the older man's expression. This wasn't a last-minute decision. This was planned, calculated. Meredith finally found her voice. "Gerald, this is..." She forced a laugh, shaking her head slightly. "This is unexpected. Surely the board needs to..." Gerald lifted a hand, silencing her with a single look. "The decision has already been made." A sharp breath left her lips, but she recovered quickly. She straightened her back, her voice smoothing out into something almost diplomatic. "Of course. But with all due respect, Shaquille's expertise is impressive, but this company is..." "A company that needs leadership," Gerald interrupted. "Leadership isn't just about years in a corporate office, Meredith. It's about vision, about trust, and about understanding the future before it arrives." His tone wasn't sharp, but it was final. Meredith inhaled slowly, forcing a smile. "And of course, we all respect Shaquille's contributions, but from a business perspective, don't you think this is a risky move?" Shaq finally spoke, his voice steady. "Why is it risky?" Meredith turned to him, her expression still poised, but her eyes betraying her frustration. "Because leadership requires experience, and Von Tech. Leadership requires results," Shaq said smoothly. "It requires knowing people, knowing how to adapt, how to handle pressure when the stakes are high." He tilted his head slightly. "I'd say I've been handling that my entire career." Meredith held his gaze, her smile tight. "But corporate leadership?" Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make everyone listen. "Meredith, you've been playing this game for weeks now. Let's stop pretending." The air in the room shifted. Every executive turned their attention fully to the exchange. Shaq's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. "You've been trying to paint me as an outsider, as someone who doesn't belong here. But let me make one thing clear. I didn't get here by accident, and I'm not going anywhere." Silence. Gerald nodded, his expression approving. He turned back to the rest of the board. "This transition will be immediate. Shaquille and I will work together over the coming weeks to ensure a smooth shift in leadership." He glanced at Meredith, his gaze steady. "I expect full cooperation from everyone." Meredith's jaw clenched ever so slightly, but she nodded. Of course. The meeting wrapped up soon after, but the weight of what had just happened lingered long after the executives filtered out. Shaq didn't celebrate, didn't react. Instead, he walked out of the boardroom as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't just been named CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the country. But he knew this wasn't over. Meredith wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was already plotting, already recalibrating. He could see it in her expression before she left the room, the way her mind was moving faster than her words. As he walked down the hall, Gerald fell into step beside him. "You know she's going to fight this," the older man murmured. Shaq nodded. "I'm counting on it." Gerald smirked. "Good, then you'll be ready for what comes next." Shaq glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "I was ready the moment I walked into that room." The news of Shaquille O'Neal's appointment as CEO of Von Tech spread like wildfire. Some called it bold, others called it reckless. The media had a field day with the announcement, headlines ranging from "NBA legend takes the helm of tech giant" to "unconventional leadership or corporate stunt." Investors, employees, and industry analysts all had their opinions, and not all of them were favorable. And Meredith Lane? She saw an opportunity. She had lost the boardroom battle, but the war was far from over. If there was one thing she understood better than anyone, it was perception. Leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about how those decisions were seen. And perception could be manipulated. It started subtly. A conversation here, an offhand remark there. Meredith didn't need to outright attack Shaq's credibility. She only needed to let people draw their own conclusions. At an executive luncheon, she leaned in close to a well-respected department head and sighed. "You know, I admire Shaq. He's a legend. But leading a tech empire? It's just a completely different skill set. I worry about what this means for our long-term stability." The department head, caught off guard, nodded slowly. He wasn't agreeing, just considering. A day later, She had coffee with a well-connected journalist who often covered corporate leadership. She smiled politely, stirring her latte, her voice filled with concern rather than malice. I think it's wonderful that Von Tech is embracing change, but the investors, they're starting to ask questions. It's a high-pressure job. I just hope Shaq is ready for it. By the end of the week, articles began appearing with phrases like concerns among investors and questions about corporate experience. Meredith's name was never attached. It didn't have to be. The whispers were enough. Inside Von Tech, the shift was gradual but noticeable. Employees who had once been cautiously optimistic about Shaq's leadership now hesitated before speaking his name in meetings. Mid-level managers began second-guessing their directives. The higher-ups, those who had once simply observed, now engaged in hushed conversations in the hallways, exchanging speculative glances. One executive, a longtime Von Tech strategist named Richard Calloway, stopped Shaq after a morning meeting. "Shaq, can I be frank?" Richard asked, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. Shaq nodded. "Always." Richard exhaled. "There's talk. Some board members are getting nervous. They're worried about the stock, about investor confidence. I'm hearing things about leadership instability." Shaq met his gaze evenly. "You mean you're hearing Meredith?" Richard hesitated, then gave a tight nod. "She's not saying it outright, but she doesn't have to. It's the idea she's spreading, and people are listening." Shaq clasped his hands behind his back, taking a slow breath. He had been in situations like this before, not in boardrooms, but in locker rooms. Teams divided by doubt. Players losing confidence because someone had whispered in their ear that the game was already lost before it had even begun. He knew better than to fight fire with fire. Instead, he let the game play out. A week later, Shaq received a call from one of Von Tech's largest investors, a hedge fund executive named Gregory Pierce. Gregory was old school, the kind of man who valued stability over disruption. He didn't like surprises, and Shaq's appointment had been a surprise. They met in a sleek private office overlooking the city skyline. Gregory, a sharp-featured man in his 60s, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'll be direct, Shaquille," he said, pouring himself a glass of water. "Some of us are concerned. Von Tech has been a stable investment for decades, but leadership changes of this scale." He shook his head. "They can shake investor confidence." Shaq leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "And by some of us, you mean Meredith." Gregory gave a small, knowing smile. "She's cautious." Shaq nodded. "Caution's good. But fear? Fear makes people hesitate when they should be making moves." Gregory studied him, intrigued but unconvinced. "And what move are you making?" Shaq steepled his fingers. "I'm not playing defense. I'm letting my work do the talking." Gregory took a sip of water, considering. "That's admirable. But investors don't like to wait for results. We like reassurance." Shaq leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Then let me reassure you. Von Tech isn't changing direction. It's evolving. And companies that evolve, they survive. They thrive." Gregory tapped his fingers against the glass, then exhaled through his nose. "I respect confidence, Shaquille, but confidence without strategy is just noise." Shaq gave a slow, knowing smile. "Then I guess you'll want to see what I have planned for Q3. Gregory didn't respond right away. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "All right, I'll watch. But if there's turbulence, expect pressure. That's how this game works." Shaq stood, shaking his hand. "Good thing I know how to handle pressure. The rumors should have been enough. The doubt should have been enough." But Shaq wasn't reacting the way Meredith expected. He wasn't scrambling, wasn't fighting back with desperation. Instead, he was waiting. And that made her nervous. She sat in her office, scrolling through the latest stock reports. Von Tech's numbers were steady. No major investor pullouts. No dramatic internal shakeups. The pressure she had tried to create wasn't breaking him. It wasn't even touching him. She needed something bigger. Something that would make people question whether Shaquille O'Neal was truly qualified to run Von Tech. And she had just the plan. While Meredith plotted, Shaq moved quietly. He met with department heads, not in boardrooms, but in their own spaces. He walked the factory floors, visited tech labs, sat with engineers and designers. He listened, learned. Employees who had once been skeptical found themselves drawn in, not by words but by presence. Shaq didn't dictate, he absorbed. And then he made moves. A week later, a new initiative was launched, one that streamlined Vontek's operations, cutting down inefficiencies and boosting innovation, and it was his initiative. The numbers spoke for themselves. Productivity increased, engagement improved. The media, once skeptical, began shifting their narrative. And the whispers? They started turning in his favor. Meredith had been waiting for Shaq to stumble, waiting for the pressure to break him. But instead, Vontek started thriving. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. Shaq sat in his office one evening, watching the city lights from his window. His phone buzzed. A message from an investor. "I wasn't sure before, but now, you're proving them wrong." He smiled. Let them whisper. Because soon, he'd be the only voice that mattered. The weight of the title settled on Shaquille O'Neal's shoulders the moment he stepped into his new office. Vontek's headquarters sat high above the city, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the skyline. It was the kind of office that signified power, a space where multi-million-dollar decisions were made every day. But power alone didn't earn respect, and right now, respect was in short supply. The transition had been anything but smooth. The board had accepted Gerald Vaughn's decision, but acceptance didn't mean approval. Employees whispered in hallways. Executives tiptoed around their doubts. The media had its own narrative. Shaquille O'Neal, tech CEO or just another celebrity figurehead? Some headlines framed it as a bold move, a fresh perspective in an industry resistant to change. Others weren't so kind. A basketball player running a tech empire? Investors question Vontek's future. Shaq had seen it all before. Doubters, skeptics, critics who believed experience only came in one form. But experience wasn't just about sitting in boardrooms. Leadership was tested under pressure, and Shaq had spent his entire career making split-second decisions in high-stakes moments. So, he let them doubt. Because soon, the results would speak for themselves. Shaq's first week as CEO was a battlefield of silent resistance. Emails went unanswered longer than usual. Proposals moved slower. Executives who had once been polite in meetings now spoke in measured tones, their skepticism barely concealed. They weren't openly challenging him, not yet, but they weren't making it easy either. His first major executive meeting made that painfully clear. The conference room was packed. High-ranking officials, department heads, and analysts all sat in their usual places. Shaq took his seat at the head of the table, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. He wasn't nervous. He never was. But he could feel the unspoken tension. Meredith Lane sat across from him, calm and poised as ever. She had taken a step back publicly, but her influence still lingered. A senior executive, Douglas Reeves, cleared his throat. "Mr. O'Neal, I believe we should discuss the upcoming fiscal quarter. We have long-term strategies in place that—" Shaq held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Let's start with something simpler. How many of you have actually spent a full day in one of our factories?" A brief silence. A few exchanged glances. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. "I have," one woman said hesitantly. Shaq nodded. "One. Anyone else?" Silence. Shaq leaned back, letting the pause stretch. "That's the problem." Reeves frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not how executive management operates. Our roles are strategic, not operational." Shaq smiled, but there was steel behind it. "And that's why we're going to change the way we operate." The next morning, Shaq wasn't in his office. He wasn't in a meeting either. He was in the warehouse. Dressed in Vontek work gear, dark blue coveralls, steel-toed boots, and safety goggles, Shaq stepped onto the factory floor where production workers built components for the company's tech products. Machines whirred, conveyor belts hummed, and workers moved with practiced efficiency. Most of them didn't notice him at first. He was just another supervisor doing a walkthrough. Then someone looked up. "Wait, is that—" A ripple of recognition spread through the warehouse. Whispers turned into murmurs, and within moments, all eyes were on him. Shaq didn't say anything. He just grabbed a pair of gloves, stepped onto the line and started working. He lifted, he assembled, he packed. By lunchtime, sweat clung to his collar. His massive hands moved through tasks most CEOs never touched. He asked workers questions, real questions, not the scripted kind. He learned their names, their roles, their frustrations. And by the end of the day, something changed. The whispers weren't about whether he belonged anymore. They were about who he really was. Meredith watched from a distance as the media buzz shifted. The headlines had changed. Shaquille O'Neal trades CEO desk for factory floor. Is this the leadership Von Tech needs? Shaq rolls up his sleeves. Employees react to hands-on approach. This wasn't what she had planned. The image she had crafted, the out-of-touch celebrity CEO, was slipping away. She needed a new angle. So, she found it. A week later, a leaked memo surfaced. An internal Von Tech report, one written by an anonymous executive, was suddenly circulating among employees. The memo questioned Shaq's leadership style, suggesting that while his presence was motivational, his decision-making was unproven. It implied that he was more of a symbol than a strategist. Within hours, news outlets picked it up. Insider report suggests Shaq as mere figurehead. Is Von Tech running itself? The media pounced. Talk shows debated whether his leadership was real or performative. Analysts speculated whether the board was running things behind the scenes while Shaq smiled for the cameras. Meredith never claimed responsibility. She didn't have to. The doubt was back, and this time it was louder. But Shaq? He had expected it. 2 days after the memo leaked, Shaq called for an all-hands executive meeting. The room was full. Meredith was there. Reeves was there. The entire leadership team. The tension was palpable. Shaq walked in, set a stack of documents on the table, and let the silence build. Then he spoke. This company is worth $40 billion, and right now the world thinks it's running itself. A few executives shifted. No one spoke. Shaq tapped the leaked memo. This says I'm just a figurehead, so let's test that theory. He picked up a remote and clicked. A presentation lit up the screen. Projected growth trends, logistics breakdowns, efficiency reports, financial forecasts. Shaq knew every number. He walked the room through Von Tech's Q3 projections, pointing out weaknesses in supply chain logistics. He broke down a flawed vendor contract that had been overlooked. He proposed a fully fleshed-out strategy for international expansion, one he had built, not an advisor. By the time he finished, there was no doubt. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a figurehead. He was in control. The meeting ended in stunned silence. One by one, executives stood. Some nodded. Some murmured approval. Meredith remained seated, her expression unreadable. She had underestimated him. She wouldn't make that mistake again. As the room emptied, Gerald Vaughn clapped a hand on Shaq's shoulder. That, he murmured, is how you shut them up. Shaq smiled. He didn't need to shut them up. He just needed to show them the truth. Meredith Lane was running out of time. For weeks, she had played the long game. Whispers, doubt, media leaks, each carefully designed to undermine Shaquille O'Neal's leadership. And yet, nothing had worked. Instead of stumbling, Shaq had thrived. He had silenced critics not with words, but with actions. Employees who once hesitated now respected him. Investors who had been wary now backed him. And worst of all, the board was beginning to trust him. Meredith couldn't let that happen. If Shaq solidified his position, her future at Von Tech would be over. She had spent years shaping this company, maneuvering through boardroom politics, ensuring she was next in line for power. But now, he was in the seat that was supposed to be hers. Desperation called for drastic measures, and Meredith had one final move left to play. Meredith's plan wasn't reckless, it was calculated. Von Tech's expansion into emerging markets had been a priority under Gerald Vaughn, but Shaq had accelerated it. One of the key deals was a billion-dollar supply chain investment in Southeast Asia, a move that would cut costs and increase global reach. The deal was still in negotiations, and that made it vulnerable. Meredith had connections, people in finance, people in international trade, people who knew how to bend the rules without breaking them. If she could manipulate the deal, create a financial crisis under Shaq's watch. The board would have no choice but to question his judgment. So she made a move. Using her influence, she arranged for a private shell company to pose as one of VonTech's new overseas vendors. The contract, disguised among stacks of legal paperwork, would route millions into an offshore account under the pretense of logistics fees. On paper, it would look like a standard business transaction. In reality, it was an unauthorized financial drain. If it worked, the company would take a massive financial hit before anyone realized what had happened. By the time the damage was discovered, it would be too late. Investors would panic. The board would demand a scapegoat, and that scapegoat would be Shaq. Meredith had underestimated one thing: Shaq's instincts. He wasn't a corporate strategist in the traditional sense, but he knew how to read people. He had spent his career analyzing plays before they unfolded, predicting his opponent's next moves before they even made them. And something wasn't adding up. During a routine financial review, Shaq noticed an inconsistency, a payment flagged as urgent vendor fees. At first glance it looked normal, but the numbers didn't match. The company name was unfamiliar, and the funds had been approved without his direct authorization. Shaq didn't react. He observed. He spent the next 48 hours digging. He met with the finance team. He asked precise questions. And the deeper he went, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't an oversight. This was a setup. The next morning, Shaq walked into the boardroom earlier than usual. He stood by the window, watching the city below, his mind already 10 steps ahead. One by one, the executives filed in. Meredith arrived last, her expression unreadable. She had already heard whispers of an internal audit. She wasn't worried yet. Shaq let the room settle before speaking. "I found something interesting," he said, his voice calm but firm. "An unauthorized transaction. Millions routed through a vendor that doesn't exist." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged nervous glances. Meredith remained still, waiting. Shaq placed a folder on the table. "This contract, buried in our Southeast Asia expansion paperwork, was fast-tracked without proper approval. But here's the thing. The company behind it? It's a ghost. No employees, no real operations. Just an account designed to collect payments." Silence. Shaq's eyes moved to Meredith. "And guess whose signature approved it?" Meredith didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, forcing a small, dismissive smile. "Shaquille, international business is complex. These deals go through multiple layers. Mistakes happen." Shaq nodded. "True. Which is why I had our legal team run a full background check. Turns out this shell company? It's tied to a financial entity owned by one of your longtime associates." The room froze. For the first time, Meredith's composure cracked. Just slightly. A flicker of uncertainty. Shaq leaned forward. "That's not a mistake, Meredith. That's fraud." Meredith tried to recover. "This is absurd. I have no knowledge of—" Shaq cut her off. "I already contacted the auditors. The SEC will be getting the full report within the hour. And since VonTech is a publicly traded company—" He let the implication hang in the air. A ripple of realization moved through the room. This wasn't just internal politics anymore. This was corporate crime. Meredith opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was trapped. Checkmate. Gerald Vaughn, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but his disappointment was evident. "Meredith, I trusted you." She said nothing. The board moved swiftly. Within the hour, Meredith was removed from her position. The media would soon catch wind of the scandal, but VonTech had already released a preemptive statement, clarifying that the fraudulent activity had been exposed and neutralized by Shaq's leadership. By the end of the day, her office was emptied. And Shaq? He didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. He just went back to work. A week later, Shaq sat in his office staring out at the city. Gerald stepped inside, placing a document on the desk. "Final report," he said. "SEC cleared VonTech of any liability. You handled that well." Shaq exhaled, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't about handling it well. It was about protecting the company. Gerald studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Shaq didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the skyline, knowing that this was only the beginning. Because leadership wasn't about avoiding the game. It was about playing it better than anyone else. Shaquille O'Neal sat at the head of the table, his broad shoulders relaxed, his expression unreadable. To his left, Gerald Vaughn, the former CEO, observed with quiet intensity. Across from them, the remaining board members fidgeted with their pens, shifting in their seats, their carefully curated neutrality cracking under pressure. And then, there was her. Meredith Lane sat in her usual spot, but she looked nothing like the composed, untouchable executive she had once been. Her suit was pristine, her posture upright, but there was a stiffness to her movements, a tension in her jaw, a flicker of something she had never shown before. Uncertainty. Because this time, she wasn't in control. Shaq let the silence stretch. He knew the power of silence. He had learned it long before boardrooms, on the court, in the locker rooms, in moments when a single glance could shift an entire game. Finally, he spoke. "Meredith," he said, his deep voice calm, steady. "You know why we're here." She swallowed once, then forced a tight smile. "Shaquille, let's not waste time," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "The evidence is clear. Fraud, manipulated contracts, a financial scheme that could have put Von Tech in serious danger." A murmur rippled through the board, some members nodding in reluctant agreement. The facts weren't up for debate. Meredith had played a dangerous game, and she had lost. For the first time since this battle had begun, Meredith Lane had no cards left to play. Gerald leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Meredith, as you know, Von Tech has conducted a full internal audit. The findings are undeniable. The SEC has been informed, and while legal consequences will depend on their ruling, this board has already reached a decision regarding your position." She remained silent, her fingers curling slightly on the table's edge. Gerald exhaled. "Effective immediately. You are removed from Von Tech in all capacities." The words landed with finality. Some board members glanced at each other, as if expecting some last-minute outburst from Meredith, some desperate attempt to regain footing. But she didn't react. Not right away. She stared at the table, as if running through 1,000 alternate scenarios, each one ending the same way. Then, with slow precision, she nodded. "I see," she said quietly. No fight, no argument, just resignation. It should have been satisfying. The woman who had worked tirelessly to sabotage him was finally out. But Shaq felt no satisfaction. Instead, he saw something else in Meredith's expression. Fear. Not of losing power, but of what came next. Shaq leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Meredith," he said, softer this time. She looked up, her eyes sharp, waiting for the final blow. The humiliation. The speech about karma, about how she had brought this on herself. But it never came. Instead, Shaq's voice remained calm. "What you did was wrong. It was calculated. It was selfish." He let the words settle. "But I don't think that's all you are." A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "You played this game because you were afraid," Shaq continued. "Afraid of being pushed aside, afraid of not having control. But control doesn't come from stepping on people. It comes from earning trust. And you lost that." Meredith held his gaze, but there was something different now. Less steel, more reflection. Shaq exhaled. "You're out of Von Tech. That's done. But what happens after this? That's up to you." She frowned slightly, clearly expecting something harsher, something cruel. But Shaq had never been that kind of leader. "I've watched you manipulate, scheme, pull strings behind the scenes," he said. "You're smart. Too smart to waste your talent like this." He let that sit. Then, with deliberate clarity, he added, "So don't." Meredith blinked. For the first time, true emotion flickered across her face. Something raw, something real. And Shaq knew then that this was the moment that would stay with her. Not the firing, not the scandal, but the fact that when she expected revenge, she got grace. Meredith's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. She straightened her blazer, took a slow breath, and looked around the room. No one spoke. No one reached out to her. The board had moved on. The company had moved on. And she would have to, too. She turned to Shaq, studying him. There was something unreadable in her expression. Pride, maybe? Respect? Or just the realization that she had spent so much time trying to destroy a man who had just spared her dignity. "Good luck, Shaquille," she said quietly. And then she walked out. No press conference. No public outburst. Just the quiet exit of someone who had finally understood that power wasn't everything. When the door closed behind Meredith, the tension in the room broke. The board members shifted, some gathering their notes, others exchanging glances. There was a sense of finality, but also something else. Something like relief. Gerald turned to Shaq, shaking his head. "You handled that better than I would have." Shaq smiled slightly. "Not everything has to be a fight." Gerald chuckled. "You sure about that? You've been fighting since the day you walked in here." Shaq nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, but not for revenge. Just for what's right." The boardroom settled. Conversations turned back to business, to strategy, to the future. And at the center of it all, Shaquille O'Neal remained, not just as the CEO of Vontech, but as a leader who had proven that true power wasn't about winning. It was about knowing when to let go. Months had passed since Meredith Lane's fall from Vontech. In the corporate world, time moved fast. Companies adapted, faces changed, new deals were made, and old scandals faded into the background. Vontech, under Shaquille O'Neal's leadership, was thriving. The doubts that once plagued his appointment had vanished, replaced by results. The media had shifted from skepticism to admiration. Investors had regained confidence, and the company had expanded into new global markets with record-breaking success. Shaq had won, and yet his mind kept drifting back to her. Meredith Lane had once been the most powerful woman in Vontech, feared, respected, and at times, ruthless. But now, she was a ghost. No one spoke about her anymore. She had disappeared from boardrooms, from headlines, from the elite corporate circles where she once thrived. Some said she had left the country. Others believed she was quietly consulting in smaller firms, trying to rebuild her reputation. But Shaq knew what real exile looked like. She wasn't just forgotten. She had been erased. And something about that didn't sit right with him. Shaq didn't go looking for Meredith. But fate had a funny way of bringing things full circle. It was late afternoon when he arrived at a downtown community center, a place Vontech had been funding for months. The foundation he had launched was focused on financial literacy and career rehabilitation, helping people who had fallen from success find a way back up. As he stepped inside, the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. Men and women, former executives, small business owners, once prominent professionals, sat in groups, discussing opportunities, strategies, and ways to start over. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw her, Meredith Lane. She looked different. The sharp suits, the cold confidence, the power-driven presence, gone. In their place was a woman who seemed tired, not weak, not broken, but humbled. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes professional but understated. She sat with a group of people, listening more than talking, nodding as others spoke about their struggles, their attempts to start over. For a moment, Shaq considered walking away. But then, as if sensing his presence, Meredith lifted her gaze and met his. And in that instant, everything changed. She didn't run, didn't look away. Instead, she stood. Slowly. There was hesitation, uncertainty, two things she had never shown before. As Shaq approached, the tension between them was undeniable. "Shaquille," she said, her voice quieter than he remembered. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Meredith." A beat of silence passed before she exhaled, shaking her head. "I didn't expect to see you here." Shaq shrugged. "Didn't expect to see you here either." A small, humorless chuckle left her lips. "Yeah, well, life's full of surprises." Shaq crossed his arms, watching her carefully. "So, what are you doing here?" Meredith hesitated. Then finally she spoke, trying to figure out what's next. She gestured toward the people around them. Turns out I'm not the only one who's had to start over. Shaq nodded, absorbing her words. Then, he asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. How are you? It was simple, but it made Meredith pause. For months, people had whispered about her. Some had written her off entirely, but no one, not one person, had actually asked. She swallowed, her voice quiet. Honestly, I don't know. Some days I feel like I deserve this. Other days, I don't even know who I am anymore. Shaq didn't respond immediately. He let her sit with her own words, let her process them fully. Then, he said something that caught her completely off guard. I want you to come work for me. Meredith blinked, stunned into silence. What? Shaq's expression remained steady. You heard me. Her brows furrowed. You're offering me a job? Shaq nodded. I'm offering you a chance. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Shaquille, I tried to ruin you. I went after your career, your reputation. I know, he said, cutting her off. And I also know you're better than that. She stared at him, struggling to process what was happening. Why would you do this? Shaq exhaled. Because I believe in redemption, and because I know what it's like to have the world count you out. He leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. You made mistakes, big ones. But I don't think that's all you are. You were one of the sharpest minds at VonTech, and you understand corporate structures better than most people I've met. That talent doesn't just disappear, it just needs to be redirected. Meredith's jaw clenched. And you trust me? Just like that? Shaq's lips curled into a small smile. Trust? Number trust is earned. But I believe you deserve a shot to earn it. She looked away, processing his words. The offer was insane. It went against everything she expected, everything she thought she knew about the world. And yet, for the first time in months, she felt something close to hope. Meredith took a deep breath, then met his eyes again. What's the job? Shaq smirked. Director of Business Development for this foundation. You know how to build things. Now you'll build opportunities. For people who need them. A long silence passed between them. Then finally, Meredith nodded. I'll do it, she said softly. Shaq extended his hand. Then let's get to work. She hesitated for just a second, and then with a deep breath, she shook his hand. A deal made, not out of power, not out of manipulation, but out of something real. And just like that, Meredith Lane's story wasn't over. It was just beginning again. The dust had settled. VonTech was no longer a company in transition. Under Shaquille O'Neal's leadership, it had become a force, not just in technology, but in corporate culture. The skepticism that once surrounded his appointment had faded into the background, replaced by a newfound respect. The numbers spoke for themselves. Stock prices had climbed steadily. The company's expansion into global markets had exceeded projections. More importantly, VonTech had become a company that employees believed in again. But for Shaq, success wasn't just about numbers. It was about proving something bigger. That leadership wasn't about titles. It was about trust. Shaq's presence had changed everything. VonTech had been a powerhouse before, but it had also been cold, a place where power plays and silent battles dictated the flow of leadership. That culture had been embedded in the company for years. But Shaq wasn't just running a business. He was rebuilding it. He made it a priority to know his employees, not just as workers, but as people. He walked factory floors, sat in on marketing meetings, listened to entry-level staff just as intently as he listened to senior executives. No one was invisible. One afternoon, during a routine office visit, a young employee named David approached him hesitantly. Mr. O'Neal, can I ask you something? Shaq turned, giving him his full attention. Of course. David hesitated. When you first got this job, did you ever feel like you weren't supposed to be here? Shaq studied him for a moment, then smiled. Every single day. David's eyes widened slightly. But you never showed it. Shaq chuckled. That's because I knew something the doubters didn't. He paused, then added, I knew I belonged. whether they saw it or not. David nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Then, with renewed confidence, he thanked Shaq and walked away. Moments like that were what mattered, because leadership wasn't just about making decisions. It was about changing the way people saw themselves. Months after Meredith Lane's departure, Shaq received an unexpected call. He was in his office, reviewing an upcoming expansion proposal, when his assistant knocked. "Sir, there's a call for you." Shaq nodded without looking up. "Who is it?" His assistant hesitated. "Meredith Lane." Shaq looked up. Now that was interesting. He picked up the phone. Meredith. Her voice was steady, but different, less calculated, more real. "I just wanted to say, I get it now." Shaq leaned back in his chair, waiting. "I spent my whole career thinking power was about control," she continued. "But it's not. It's about impact. You showed me that." Shaq smiled slightly. "Took you long enough." She actually laughed, something he had never heard from her before. "Yeah, it did." A beat of silence passed before she added, "Thank you. For the second chance. For not destroying me when you had every reason to." Shaq exhaled, nodding to himself. "Everybody deserves a shot at redemption, Meredith. You just had to take it." She didn't argue, didn't deflect. Instead, she simply said, "Good luck, Shaquille." And then she hung up. As Shaq set the phone down, he knew one thing for sure. That chapter was officially closed. Years from now, people wouldn't just remember Shaquille O'Neal as the CEO who proved everyone wrong. They would remember the way he led, the way he treated people, the way he never let doubt define him. Because in the end, leadership wasn't about where you came from. It was about where you were going, and who you took with you. Some leaders are made. Others make themselves. Shaquille O'Neal didn't just prove them wrong, he changed the game. What happens when power, prejudice, and redemption collide? This was just one story. But in a world where underdogs rise and old empires fall, there's always another. The real question is, who's next? Stay with us, because the next move is already in play.